Go pick me out a winner, Bobby. And a hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 138 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here on this late Monday afternoon into early evening in New York. If you're checking out episode 138 on the YouTube channel or enjoying the content but haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. So I opened with a quote from a movie which is easily in my top 10 and almost in my top 5 favorite movies of all time. But within that movie, to me, is a massively slept on and underrated performance by really one of the great stars in the history of cinema, not necessarily known as a master thespian. The 11th entry in our ongoing and apparently popular series, we have the best movie you've never seen, but most underrated film performances. The movie, now almost 40 years old, is Barry Levinson's mega classic sports film, The Natural. And the actor is Robert Redford. Now, I first saw The Natural in theaters. It opened in May of 1984. So as I say, we're almost up to 40 years. And I was 10. And my father had read Bernard Malamud's book. Bernard Malamud he's one of the masters. There's no arguing how great of a novelist Bernard Malamud. When you have people who wrote multiple masterpieces, and The Natural, The Fixer, Malamud was an extraordinary talent and a great novelist. My father had read Malamud's book. I hadn't. I saw the movie, I went in cold, as they say. I read the book later. It's easy to sleep on Redford's performance. The main character in both book and film his name is Roy Hobbs, but he's almost too gifted. His skill level is too great for it to be altogether believable, and it's kind of the point. You're in a world which has real baseball and baseball players who are talented. Joe DiMaggio, at least in the movie version, I'm not sure I think he might be mentioned in the book. But you have great all-time Hall of Famer baseball players. And then you have this guy, Roy Hobbs, whose skill level is off the charts. So the most talented baseball player in history, and there's a lot of discussion now with Shohei Ohtani, but the answer to that question is still Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth was probably the best pitcher of his era, and he was the best hitter of his era. Babe Ruth was a genetic freak in the best possible sense. An incredible pitcher and a guy who was out homering entire teams by himself in the so-called dead ball era. Well, Roy Hobbs is Babe Ruth. That's who he most closely resembles in terms of his skill sets. When we meet Roy Hobbs, he's a little boy, but then Robert Redford takes over the role when Roy is probably supposed to be 18. And so many great actors, many of whom are gone now, but so many wonderful actors fill out the cast. And Glenn Close, who is still very much, she and Michael Douglas had a little Easter Sunday gag with a bunny rabbit on Instagram. It was a fucking scream. But Robert Redford assumes the role of Roy Hobbs about 10 to 15 minutes into the movie. He's supposed to be about 18. And at this point in Roy Hobbs' journey, he's a pitcher. Now, we assume he could probably hit, but we don't actually see him hitting. What we know from him is he is a freakishly talented pitcher. As Babe Ruth was a freakishly talented pitcher who could hit, but he wasn't out in the outfield like with Shohei Ohtani pitching and DHing and all of this. It was a different sport. In the time this movie is set, which is, I guess, late 1930s, and in Babe Ruth's time, his prime was like the 1920s, kind of into the early to middle 30s. But Redford, who was not ever known as a master thespian or a very expressive actor. When we meet him, as I say, at age 18, he's more expressive than he normally would be. He's young and full of life. And even though Redford was in his mid-40s at the time, he can't really be 18, but he gets the bounce in the kid's step, the movements. Because Redford in real life was a phenomenal athlete, and he was a great baseball player, it helps to add to the realism of his performance, because there have been plenty of baseball movies where the actor could not play. William Bendix in the Babe Ruth story in the late 40s, the guy could barely swing a bat. John Goodman, who I love, in the 1992 Babe Ruth movie, he looks like he can't really swing the bat. And that's a problem. Kevin Costner in Bull Durham, he could swing. He didn't look like he could hit the ball 400 feet, but at least he had an idea of what he was doing. Robert Redford swings the bat like Ted Williams. And his athleticism and the fact that he had played baseball, it's all part of the reason why this performance is so good, because he sells the athletic aspects. And in the early scenes, he sells the youthful exuberance and the really incredible athleticism of this young man without beating us over the head with it. So Roy Hobbs, as we meet him, has already absorbed terrible tragedy. His father has passed when he was very young. And as he is presumably mourning his dad, he makes a baseball bat, out of a tree. This is, I guess, something that you could do in the 19-teens. It's not something you would ever think of now, but he makes a legal baseball bat in a tree that split open by lightning on the night that his father passed from a heart attack. And he names the bat Wonder Boy. And this is in the book as well as the movie. Now, the movie kind of gets into the whole Arthurian legend thing, because Bernard Malamud clearly is telling a King Arthur story in the novel. Wonder Boy is Excalibur, the manager of the team that the later Roy Hobbs joins, Pop Fisher. Fisher King. Is this really very complicated? It's not. Now, I didn't get that when I first saw the movie. I just thought they were naming it, and the bat had nothing to do with anything. It wasn't until I read the book later where, this is a story. This is an Arthurian legend story. I thought this was about, it is kind of about baseball. But anyway, that's beside the point. Just a little background for you. Shit goes wrong for Roy Hobbs again. He shows extraordinary pitching ability in striking out the Babe Ruth of his day. Fantastic actor, Joe Don Baker. Boy, that guy was great. So many different kinds of roles, from James Bond films to this, to he was in the original Walking Tall. They did a remake with The Rock about 20 years ago. Just a very large, menacing, intimidating actor. He could play good or bad. And in the movie The Natural, he plays kind of in the middle. His name is Walter Wambold, and he's known as the Whammer. And he's supposed to be, as I say, the Babe Ruth of his day. It's ironic that you have two characters in the same movie based on Babe Ruth, at least loosely. That Roy Hobbs, the left-handed, throwing 100 miles an hour, and his aim is so good he could take the hair off of an ant from 100 feet away, like that kind of thing. And it turns out that he's an extraordinary hitter, but Walter Wambold is clearly modeled on Babe Ruth. So Babe Ruth, who had already passed by the time Malamud's book came out, was informing the author as he wrote the story. More tragedy awaits Roy Hobbs. I won't go into any spoilers for people who haven't seen this movie. It's extraordinary. And these segments of the movie follow the book very closely, very closely. We leave 18-year-old Roy with all the talent in the world, and we pick up many years later, probably about 20 years later, as now Robert Redford looks, he's more believable as a 35-year-old, because Redford looked phenomenal for a guy in his 40s. And he's not pitching anymore when we resume Roy's narrative and his story. He's absorbed more tragedy, and now he's making a comeback and trying to get to the major leagues as an outfielder. Can't pitch anymore. And the spring is gone from his step. He now moves slower. He moves like somebody with the weight of tragedy and just really shitty luck hanging over him. And this isn't something that age 10 me would pick up on first viewing. But this is something now, if you look for it and you understand film acting, and now you don't necessarily have to be Bobby De Niro, Mr. De Niro, Bobby D, Big Al, Al Pacino, Laurence Olivier, Dustin Hoffman, Jack Nicholson, Daniel Day-Lewis, Leonardo DiCaprio, Tom Hardy. You don't have to be that level of versatile to be really good at film acting. And Robert Redford, just the difference in movements between he's 18, now he's 35. He's still an incredible athlete, but he now moves, and you feel the weight of the years and the tragedy. You see it on Redford's face, and you feel it in the way his line readings are different, his inflections are different, and there's no more boyish enthusiasm. Because let's face it, he's supposed to be about 35. It's not that old. I mean, Aaron Judge is how old now? 32? Derek Jeter was still bouncing around in his mid to late 30s. But this guy has been beaten up and beaten down. He's had an incredible amount of hardship and just really rotten luck. In the book suggests that he was making his own rotten luck. The book suggests that this guy, despite all of his talent, he's lacking when it comes to character. And there was a reason why this book, which was very well regarded, is not by accident that it took 30 years to make this book. And I'll give you a little spoiler without really spoiling it. The book was thought to be unproducible, unfilmable as a movie because it was very dark and very depressing. The movie is dark and has moments of horrible tragedy and awful moments, and can, in parts, is very depressing. But they didn't cast a golden boy, who was already a fucking legend by 1984, an Oscar winner for directing and producing Ordinary People. The Sundance Kid himself, Johnny Hooker from The Sting. They didn't cast him so that he could do what he did in the 70s and get bumped off and or lose in a lot of movies, whether it was The Great Waldo Pepper, films like that, where his character doesn't have all the answers. No, they cast him because they were going to take this very dark, dirty, grimy novel, and they were going to turn it into something beautiful, if I may say. But Redford does not act as if he is somebody who knows that he is touched by God or that he has this extraordinary talent. Yes, he knows he has a talent, but he doesn't come across any way like he does in the book. The Roy Hobbs of the novel is pessimistic, sarcastic. He's kind of a dick. He's just kind of an asshole. And the way Redford plays Hobbs in the movie, and this is obviously, they're just following the script, he is more humble and his heart is in the right place. And there's less an idea of him continuing to screw up because of a lack of character and more of an idea, no, this guy doesn't lack character. He's just had bad luck. And maybe now, as an older person, his luck will change. So he goes to work for the New York Knights as a reserve outfielder. And great actors like Michael Madsen, years before Stuck in the Middle with You, years before Reservoir Dogs, years before he really blew up as a movie star, Kill Bill, working with Tarantino again. Michael Madsen, phenomenal. Kim Basinger, a great early performance. She turned around from Sean Connery, the last James Bond film that Connery did, the kind of renegade, Never Say Never Again. She turned around from that right into The Natural. She is fantastic. She is the literal embodiment of how Memo Paris, the character, is described in the book. You could not have cast that part any better than they did. The judge, Robert Prosky, another phenomenal old actor, exactly the way Bernard Malamud describes him. Gus Sands, Darren McGavin, the old man in A Christmas Story. Again, the casting is so dead on accurate in this film. And Redford, probably a lot better looking than how Roy Hobbs is described. But Redford matches the energy and the talent around him. Richard Farnsworth, Oscar nominee for David Lynch's The Straight Story many years later. Another incredible film actor. He was in Misery with James Caan. He played I think he was the sheriff. There's that spice. needless to say, there would be no movie if there was not achievement and if there wasn't something other than one bad thing after another happening to Roy Hobbs. Well, he is not just any old right fielder. He plays like Babe Ruth. He plays offense like Babe Ruth, hitting one home run after another, out-homering teams, even at a time where other players were hitting, 30, 40 homers in a season. He can't pitch anymore, but he sure as fuck can hit. He's like a Joe DiMaggio, a Ted Williams, a Babe Ruth, a Lou Gehrig, only better. And there is some intricacies of plot that took place in the book that's in the movie, but in summation, this character called the Judge is going to be able to buy out the manager and part owner of the New York Knights. That's the baseball team. It's not a real team. It's a National League. It's an iteration of the National League where the Yankees exist in the American League, but we don't hear about the Brooklyn Dodgers or the New York Giants, I don't think. Those were the real New York baseball National League teams of the day, long before the Mets. The Judge is going to be able to buy out Pop Fisher and send Pop Fisher packing. So the Knights need to win the pennant to keep that from happening. So that's the goal. That's the kind of goal that is laid out in the movie. And the team is in last place, and Roy Hobbs shows up, and all of a sudden, they're going to fucking tear. So the film follows the highs and lows and everything in between. And even within the context of, we see just how much skill this guy has. Roy Hobbs still gets laid low a bunch of times, literally. There's still terrible shit that takes place, that he has to absorb more failure and more disappointment. And you have Glenn Close, really wonderful performance. She's with him at the very beginning when they're kids, 18. She's the one who sends him off to Chicago for the fateful train ride where he ends up striking out the whammer, but shit goes wrong from there. So she plays the woman who is there's the good and evil. It's a little bit like Platoon a few years later, where you have two military men, Elias, played by Willem Dafoe, and Barnes, played by Tom Berenger. They're both military men. They're both well-trained. One guy is good, one guy is evil. And in the world of the natural, it's not really much of a spoiler. Glenn Close represents wholesome and good. And Kim Basinger as Memo represents sexy as hell, but stay away from her. She's probably bad luck. And if she isn't bad luck, she'll still screw your head around and you won't know which end is up. So in the world of the book, there are bribes, there are payoffs, and there are hints of what was known as the Black Sox scandal, where Major League Baseball, and this is another reason why Babe Ruth is such an important historical figure. In 1919, the Chicago White Sox, because their owner, Charlie Comiskey, if any of you ever heard of Comiskey Park, it's named after this fuck named Charlie Comiskey. Charlie Comiskey nickel and dimed his players, who he loved his guys, but he was so fucking cheap. He was so cheap that he didn't pay them right, and he was the kind of guy that would welsh on bonuses because wording of the contract would let him save $500. He was probably the richest owner in sports at that time. And he was awful. So in the real world, Chicago White Sox took bribes and threw the 1919 World Series. They won 3 games. There was, I think, a best out of 9 then. So they made it believable, but they threw the World Series. Baseball could have come to a crashing halt were it not for George Herman, Babe Ruth. And were it not for the miracle that had the owner of the Boston Red Sox, Harry Frazee, so desperate to have a Broadway play that he sold Babe Ruth to the Yankees in exchange for a mortgage on Fenway Park, as dumb as that sounds, and he was able to put on this play called, it was a musical, No, No, Nanette. Babe Ruth got to the Yankees, and they very quickly, when they realized this guy's a fucking monster offensive player, we're going to take him off the mound. Babe Ruth hit 54 home runs his first year with the Yankees, 59 home runs the next year. He was tearing it up. The Black Sox scandal probably would have ended the sport were it not for the excitement. Again, 100 years ago, no TV, there was radio and newspapers. But even with those limitations, Babe Ruth made the sport bearable again. It made people who like baseball excited. You have a man who's hit 54 home runs and most teams are hitting 30. Think about that for context. Doubling the home run output of entire teams, one guy. So that's the background of Babe Ruth, and the fact that all the gambling and the payoffs and bets and all of the stuff that goes on in the world of the movie The Natural is informed by the Black Sox scandal. So there are moments in the book where Roy Hobbs takes a bribe, seems to take a bribe. When it happens in the movie, we know that he's not going to go through with it because it's not the movie that they're making. And this is a thing, if you read the book and you compare it, you can see that it's building towards something other than where it goes in the book. So you have this payoff and this big game at the end. And by the time you kind of reach the end of the movie, you're pretty sure you know where it's going, but you're not entirely sure. And then the waters get muddied because there's another extraordinary actor who is still around, Robert Duvall. Now, Robert Duvall is on that list of people who I argue has never given a bad performance. Robert Duvall brings it every time. Whether he's playing opposite Travolta in A Civil Action, which one of his last Oscar-nominated performances where he just crushes that role. You know, the kind of homespun Southern attorney who you think doesn't know which end is up, but is actually smarter than Travolta. Like, fucking great performance. Robert Duvall in this film also almost a literal embodiment of how a character of Max Mercy, a sports writer and cartoonist. There were a lot of those guys like Grantland Rice back in the day. It is a great name to Google. Grantland Rice, considered the greatest sports writer of the first half of the 20th century. You can Google him. Robert Duvall plays Max Mercy. Max Mercy, he's not really a good guy and he's not a bad guy, and he's never less than believable. And Duvall imbues him with this spirit of wanting to entertain people, even if it means hurting others. But he plays the role with such joy. He's happy when he's doing shit that's bad, and he's also happy when he knows, hey, Roy Hobbs is going to make me a great story. We're all going to make money here. I love this guy. And there are scenes between Redford as Roy Hobbs and Duvall as Max Mercy. Again, Redford ups his game. Because Duvall, what he does with his eyes, the guy is amazing. I don't know how he wasn't nominated for supporting actor, but he gave so many great performances in this era. He had just won an Oscar for Tender Mercies. He just knocked them all out of the park. But the character of Max Mercy has moments where you hate him, but then other moments where you just say, no, this is what he would be. He's trying to get more people to read the newspaper. He's trying to make money. He's trying to break big stories. It's an incredible performance and a great character. But there is a moment in The Natural where we've seen Roy Hobbs apparently take a bribe, and Redford basically has what amounts to a face-off with the judge, Gus, that's the Darren McGavin character, the judge, the great old actor Robert Prosky, and Kim Basinger as Memo Paris. And Redford walks in unarmed, and we don't know who's got a gun or anything like that, but he walks in unarmed, and he drops this huge fucking sheaf of cash, $10,000, whatever the amount is, on the table, and all but spits at Robert Prosky as the judge. You dropped this on your way out, last time we saw each other. And this scene doesn't develop the way that we think it will. But basically, the movie builds to one game. And the whole thing that I was mentioning where, and how could I not have said, Wilford Brimley plays Pop Fisher. Fisher King, Arthurian legend, all of that shit. Excalibur, hell, the movie The Fisher King, 7 years later. Wilford Brimley, who already looked a lot older than his actual age, I don't even think he was 50. He plays a guy who looks like he's scraping 70. Maybe he's 65, he looks like in this movie. He plays Pop Fisher, and he is such a lovable curmudgeon. When you ever wonder what's a lovable curmudgeon, Wilford Brimley in the movie The Natural is a lovable curmudgeon. He's a pain in the ass. He complains nonstop. I should have been a farmer. From the day I was born, I should have been a farmer. He's so endearing. that you understand as the audience and as Roy Hobbs why it's so important they get the pennant. It has nothing to do with the World Series. The deal that Pop had with the judge was if the Knights somehow managed to win the pennant, it doesn't matter if they get swept by the Yanks or whoever in the World Series, Pop can buy out that motherfucker. He can buy out the judge. And everything will be ipsy-pipsy. So there's an extraordinary moment late in this film as they're getting ready for a big playoff game, like the Yankees in '78 with the Red Sox, where everything comes down to one game. Go to the World Series in the world of this movie, or in the Yankees in '78, go to the championship series, one notch before the World Series, but the same concept, just one game. Not a playoff series, a playoff or play-in game. In the world of this movie, it's a play-in game to get to the World Series. Yankees, Red Sox, the famous Bucky fucking Dent game, was to get to the championship series. That was a play-in game. It was game number 163 of the 1978 season. It's the same concept in The Natural. And again, a little bit of a spoiler, Roy's physical condition is compromised, and it doesn't seem as if he's going to be able to play. That's the lead-in to him having the confrontation with the judge and Gus and Memo. And then he goes to see Pop Fisher, who himself is getting ready for the game and has already penciled Roy Hobbs. His original lineup, he's not in it because they don't think he's going to be able to play. And there is a scene between these two guys, between Wilford Brimley as Pop and Robert Redford as Roy Hobbs. Now remember, Roy Hobbs grew up on a farm. He was a farmer. So all of the talk of Wilford as Pop Fisher, I should have been a farmer, and he keeps repeating this shit. I should have been a farmer. My mom always said I should have been a farmer. And Roy Hobbs shocks Pop. And he says, ain't nothing like a farm, because we know he grew up on one. And Pop says, you know, my mom always said I ought to be a farmer. And Robert Redford, with that home run smile, which he hasn't flashed, barely flashed since the scenes where he was a kid. Redford hits you with that $1 million smile, the hair, and it's kind of almost a halo the way that he's filmed. This is, again, not an accident. Levinson knew exactly how he was framing his star. But when Pop says, you know, my mom said I ought to be a farmer, and Redford just says, my dad wanted me to be a baseball player. It's like the opposite of Pop. His mom wanted him to be a farmer, and he ended up a baseball player and now a manager. Redford grew up on a farm. He was a farmer, but his dad wanted him to be a baseball player. And as Pop points out, just what the audience would say, you're better than everyone. You're better than anyone I've ever had. You're the best fucking hitter I've ever seen. Suit up. And then, obviously, we go into the final game, which I won't spoil. But there's so many, this isn't a movie that you would expect a lot of twists and turns, because on the surface, it looks like a straightforward story of perhaps redemption, athletic achievement, period piece, old school, all of that. But there are so many twists and turns that the first-time viewers won't see coming. And at the center of it all is as great a star, as great a guy. I mean, Robert Redford, what an amazing man. The Sundance Institute, what he's done for independent film, you wouldn't know, because the number of huge Hollywood productions that he appeared in, that he would have been such a champion of the little guy, quote unquote, especially when it came to independent films. I mean, Quentin Tarantino, Reservoir Dogs, where did that make its first big splash? Sundance Film Festival. Who created that? Robert Redford. This is not just an actor, a producer, a director. This is a movie business icon. As important a figure as almost anyone who ever worked in the business, just for Sundance. If you took everything else out, he is still a pivotal figure in the proliferation and the money being made available to young filmmakers who otherwise may not have had the capacity. Redford, as this film reaches its conclusion, you get to see the smile more and more. But with all of the achievement that his character has, ultimately, and this is the irony, he wants to go back to being a farmer. His best life is not continuing to play baseball. Once he does, if he is able to achieve his objective, he wants to settle down. And this is where you get into the twist that you don't see coming. I'm not going to spoil it. But something to do with the early scenes with him and Glenn Close so many years earlier in the world of the story, 2 decades. And as much as I'll spoil it, there are 2 moments of home runs being hit in this film. One where bat breaks, and one where he knocks the cover off the ball. That's a famous scene. But the tease of what I said at the beginning, go pick me out a winner, Bobby. The bat boy for the New York Knights, a kid named Bobby Savoy, Roy becomes friends with him because he's very friendly. He tries to get along with everybody. Whereas, again, in the book, he was kind of a dick. But he tries to get along with everybody, and he befriends the bat boy, this kid, Bobby Savoy. And he has this bat, Roy, Wonder Boy. It's the only bat he uses. And the kid says, could you maybe help me make one of those bats? Because Roy explained, well, I made this bat for myself from a tree that split open by lightning. So the 2 of them make a bat for the kid. And the bat is called a Savoy Special because the kid's name is Bobby Savoy. And at a critical moment in the film where the season is on the line, Pop Fisher's future, the judge, Gus, Memo, everybody's immediate, near-term financial health, actual health, who's going to own this team tomorrow, is coming down to one at-bat of Roy Hobbs. And he breaks his bat. Wonder Boy is no more. And as Roy holds the pieces of his destroyed bat, which has carried him through the whole movie, but that he made when he was probably 12, maybe 13, and now it's probably 25 years later, he looks at the bat boy, and it's one of the great line readings in the history of cinema. I don't give a fuck what anybody says. Redford in this moment, you can't do it any better. Go pick me out a winner, Bobby. And the kid runs back and brings him the bat that they made together, the Savoy Special. And I won't spoil what happens next, but you can use your imagination. The irony is that Barry Levinson's movie, The Natural, is a terrible adaptation of Bernard Malamud's book. Bernard Malamud's book, the whole point seemed to be, yes, the Arthurian legend stuff, but the whole point of the book seemed to be natural talent isn't enough if you lack character. The point of the movie seems to be natural talent is enough, especially if you have character. If you have the ability to come back from getting laid low again and again, as the Roy Hobbs of this movie just keeps getting beaten up and down and keeps crawling his way back. He's not a quitter. He would never think of quitting. And he sure as fuck would never think of accepting a bribe. The movie ends on a farm and a scene of 2 people playing catch. And the musical score by Randy Newman is easily a top 10, maybe a top 5 musical score. It's up there with Chariots of Fire, what Vangelis was able to do with the synthesizer work that he puts forth in Chariots of Fire. But Newman's score in The Natural, it's as good as anything. I hate to say it, his score and his main theme in The Natural is as good as anything John Williams ever did. I love John Williams, and Randy Newman is not quite John Williams, just as Jerry Goldsmith and James Horner, James Newton Howard, they're not quite John Williams. But Randy Newman's score for The Natural is almost impossibly good, where it sounds exactly as we would imagine. It's like John Williams' score for Superman. It almost as if the score is screaming, look up in the sky, a man can fly, right? The musical score is the final piece. All the great supporting performances, as I say, from Duvall on down, the excitement of the story, the crazy twists that we're not expecting, and Roy Hobbs, Robert Redford, his finest piece of film acting. He was fully committed to this. The beautiful Ted Williams swing, the smile, the few movie star moments they allow him. They allow him that one movie star moment, the halo lighting when he's talking with Pop before the game, and another movie star moment at the very end, just before the credits, the $1 million smile. And he could be smiling and patting himself on the back for such a brilliant performance. Robert Redford as Roy Hobbs in Barry Levinson's magnificent, now almost 40-year-old sports classic movie, The Natural, adapted from the novel by Bernard Malamud. Number 11 in our continuing series of most underrated film performances. This has been episode number 138 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. Once again, I got a little emotional. Great memory seeing that movie in theaters, and I've seen it at least 15 times since. But if you caught this episode on the YouTube channel and haven't done so already and are enjoying the content, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you caught this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 139 real soon. Until then, peace.